Listening to George's remarks brought back a memory for me of my boyhood in Chicago. And I was a high school student. I had actually studied Russian. And I was working downtown in one July afternoon on a high school term paper at the public library in Chicago, which, if any of you are from Chicago, you know, and was at Randolph and Michigan. And I walked down to State Street at lunchtime and witnessed the Captive Nations Day parade. And I was part of a very thin crowd of people who stood there as all of the representatives of all the captive nations paraded down State Street in national dress. And I remember thinking at that time, it must have been 1963 or so, that I was seeing a ghost procession, that these nations were under the heel of the communist empire, that they would never emerge, at least in my lifetime. I used to get the same feeling when I passed the Lithuanian embassy on 16th Street, that that embassy would never be occupied again. But as we know, since we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, those nations came back to life, and they established their independence. And as a result of the same process, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. Another memory from that period was television broadcasts or discussions with guests who spoke about the evils of communism. And they were often fundamentalist Christians, and they were oftentimes people who were not that well educated. They didn't speak the way educated people speak, and they were very emotional, and they continually referred to dialectical materialism. And dialectical materialism, for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time studying Marxist ideology, is the core philosophical concept upon which the whole system is based. And listening to these people talk about it and insist that this was the source of all evil created a very strange impression. I thought, gosh, these folks are really dumb and ignorant. And of course, all the superior, well-educated people wouldn't give them the time of day. It wasn't until years later, when I was a correspondent in Moscow and witnessed the system firsthand and actually learned what the ideology was and how it worked, I understood they were absolutely right, that whatever impression they created, they knew far better than people who looked down on them what was the essence of the problem and what was the essence of the system. Dialectical materialism, just briefly, is radical materialism. It holds that there's no such thing as soul or spirit, and that everything is matter, which is in constant motion, and everything is constantly changing into its opposite. Now, out of that system, it's very hard to get any kind of moral principles. When the Soviet Union fell, the communist ideology fell with it. And in fact, it was the discrediting of the communist ideology that made possible the collapse of the Soviet Union. I believe it was the core reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. But communism was based on a pre-existing disrespect for the individual, a disrespect for the individual as a personality, disrespect for the value of an individual's life. And for Russia to make progress after the fall of communism, it wasn't enough that Marxism-Leninism was discredited and discarded, although that was extremely important. It was also necessary that an alternative set of values take the place of those so-called class values that were imposed by the Marxist-Leninist ideology. At first, there was great hope that that, in fact, would happen. But the process of economic change in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union was characterized by the view that all that was really necessary was to transform economic structures. And once that took place, and of course they were heavily influenced in this in this misguided notion by bad Western advice, and the tendency in America to assume that all you have to do is liberate the economy and all problems are solved. And what happened in Russia was not the establishment of genuine moral values that could become the safeguard of a system based on law, which in turn would make it possible to change over from one economic system to another. But on the contrary, the rapid criminalization of the country, which took place under conditions in which there was no law. Capitalism without legal restraints and without a legal context rapidly degenerates into gangsterism. Adam Smith, when he was asked for a definition of the market, said that the market is equivalent exchange. I give you something for which I get the equivalent in return. Now, needless to say, I don't get the exact same thing I gave you, but the value of what I gave you is the same as the value of what you've given me in compensation. Well, such a definition presupposes, given the complexity of a modern economy, the existence of the rule of law, and that's what didn't exist in Russia. There were three processes that took place during the Yeltsin years, which led to the criminalization of the country. Hyperinflation, privatization, and in fact, the creation of criminal syndicates. The hyperinflation wiped out the life savings of the entire population. Because under conditions of communist rule, prices were fixed, the hidden inflation in the last years of the Soviet Union was expressed in a shortage of goods. As soon as prices were released, and it was done in a single night, really, without warning, the inflation was so great as to wipe out the life savings of virtually the entire population, because people without the ability to buy anything simply accumulated money in their savings accounts. This meant that people who had saved in order to buy a car, an apartment, to pay for a funeral, to pay for a wedding, suddenly were totally impoverished. And I remember during those years, when I was in Moscow, I remember once there was a knock at the door of my apartment, and a woman said, "We're collecting money to pay for the funeral of a woman in the building who had died." And she had been wiped out completely, and like so many people, they didn't have enough even to pay for her funeral. And the impoverishment of the population, which took place overnight, also led to massive disillusionment, because people got their first taste of what capitalism and freedom supposedly meant under circumstances in which, without being consulted, without any regard for the amount of hard work that went into creating those savings, they were simply wiped out. The privatization program which followed was similarly corrupt and heedless of the real needs of the population. First, there was voucher privatization. According to voucher privatization, every man, woman, and child in Russia was given a voucher. So according to Anatoly Chubais, who was then the head of privatization, the voucher was worth 2 Volga automobiles in order to invest in Russian industry. But after 70 years of socialism, nobody knew what investment was, where to put their voucher. People appeared on street corners and with signs saying, "We'll buy your voucher." And they began accumulating vouchers from alcoholics, from people who had people on the street who had no idea what to do with their vouchers, oftentimes in return for a bottle of vodka. And these groups, which were often criminally connected, would then use these cheaply acquired vouchers to buy up Russian industry. Once voucher privatization was over, there was money privatization, and that was just as corrupt. The results of the auctions were determined in advance, and anyone who tried to bid honestly for an enterprise that was being offered at auction and succeeded in outbidding the pre-designated winner of the auction would immediately find that his life was being threatened, and the lives of his family members. And finally, there was a process of criminalization. The first capitalists in Russia were so-called owners of cooperatives, and these owners did not enjoy the protection of the police, because the police were there to guard state property. And at the same time, there was a law against hiring private guards. They had no choice but to start paying protection to gangs, who would then defend them against other gangs. And the criminal syndicates in Russia developed rapidly and became multi-million and multi-billion ruble enterprises. The result of all this was a corrupt oligarchy which ran the country in its own interests and despoiled the economy and led to a humanitarian catastrophe in Russia. It's estimated by demographers that there were 5 to 6 million excess deaths during the period of so-called reform. By excess deaths, or surplus deaths, I'm sorry, is the demographer's term, we mean deaths that could not have been accounted for on the basis of previous trends. And when it came time for Yeltsin to run for re-election, only a scare campaign directed against the population, and that attempted to show that if Yeltsin were defeated, there would be a return to gulags and concentration camps, allowed him to win his second term. But that didn't work when it came time to find a successor for Yeltsin. At that point, Yeltsin's public opinion polls showed that Yeltsin had 2% support in the population. And as some of you may know, in any public opinion poll, 6% of the respondents don't understand the question. And that raised doubt as to whether anyone in Russia at that point supported Yeltsin. Well, the result was the Second Chechen War, and the mysterious apartment bombings in 1999, which brought Putin to power. And since then, we've seen the radical diminution of even those elements of pluralism that existed under Yeltsin. One by one, alternative centers of power have been eliminated, whether it's a parliament which was relatively powerless anyway, but now is completely controlled. The press, big business as a result of the Khodorkovsky case. The money that was gained by the oligarchs is now exclusively at the hands of the regime. Under circumstances in which the democratic spirit that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and led to the peaceful dismantlement of communism is recaptured. If in fact the evolution of Russia becomes more than just the dismantling of Marxism-Leninism, but proceeds to the creation of those values and institutions that the country desperately needs.